Ladies and gentlemen, good morning.
Welcome to my Pollen Talk.
And welcome to my Pollen Talk. So here's the situation at the moment. Currently, our water quality across the EU is mostly terrible. We've implemented the Water Framework Directive in order to try and improve the situation and introduce management according to hydrological boundaries. However, over 60% of EU's water bodies are expected to fail to meet the Water Framework Directive targets by the deadline of 2027. And the situation is very similar in Ireland. So while our water bodies are doing a little bit better, we still find that 50% of our water bodies are not reaching the WFT targets. So what's the problem? So evaluation suggests that the Water Framework Directive at the EU level is seen as more or less fit for purpose, though obviously we can always criticise. So we need to look elsewhere. So in evaluations of the Water Framework Directive, they've effectively found that one of the key problems is that implementation is underfunded, not enough money is being made available to actually put projects on the ground. There's a huge fragmentation across sectors like energy, agriculture, water treatment, all of which are very important for achieving the goals laid out in the Water Framework Directive. And this ultimately means that these projects are being implemented very slowly at the member state level. So the reasons behind these issues are obviously complex, but a key problem is the participatory requirements of the Water Framework Directive itself. So the Water Framework Directive mandated that the delivery of these goals should be done through public participation and consultation. However, and this was intended to overcome some of these problems by accessing a broad range of knowledge from different stakeholders, improving stakeholder buy-in, and perhaps most importantly, improving the public's right to have a say in how the landscapes that they're living in are managed. However, reflecting back after 25 years of the Water Framework Directive, research suggests that there's actually very limited impacts of participation on both water quality standards and the kind of strategies that are implemented. These processes are thought to be an administrative burden and they can be dominated by lobbying interests. However, on the flip side, research similarly criticises these participatory processes as actually being box-ticking exercises. They often display tokenism and people are effectively brought into a room to be told what's going to happen, and there is actually no intention of any of the results of the participatory process making their way into decision makings. Anyway, so the question is, do we think the outcomes of the participatory processes are poor, or are we looking at poor processes? I would argue that in many cases we are looking at poor processes. And the reason why is because we actually see many collaborative efforts for water management across the world. So most notably the catchment management efforts in North America, the UK, Australia and New Zealand, and also to a certain extent in the Republic of Ireland itself. So these partnerships are cross-sectoral. They often involve stakeholders from across agriculture, may be initiated by community groups, and are very close to the place in which these projects are going to be implemented, so they have a lot of potential to broaden participation. They've been able to leverage both public and private funding and have actually really delivered projects on the ground. However, they remain, in my opinion, undervalued and actually underutilised when it comes to achieving Water Framework Directive goals. So how do we move forward and actually really make use of these organisations and acknowledge that the value that they can add to our policy efforts and the implementation of the Water Framework Directive? So I suggest three main areas. The first is we need to empower these groups and integrate them more fully into the policy process. We need to fund them, obviously. So from the perspective of the Government of the Republic of Ireland, that may mean lobbying and advocating for transformations of CAP, which is frequently criticised as not having sufficient environmental angles, as well as having really no incentives for collaborative effort. And we also need to implement national funding for these groups that's not based purely on a project-by-project basis, because this undermines their ability to, first of all, formulate, get staff, create the projects that they then want to implement, and have this longevity where their expertise can continue on and on for years. And then the third area is that we need to entrust them to take action. And that means streamlining, in some cases, the permit process, which needs to be undertaken for these groups to actually implement action on the ground. And this is part of integrating these bodies more fully into the policy and governance process. So by implementing these changes, I think we can move beyond these box-ticking exercises that we are calling participation, and don't just participate, fully recognise these bodies as important and valuable partners in the delivery of water framework goals, and collaborate.